You look at human touch, it's important that we have that physical interaction, or at least be able to be in somebody's face live. And I know how it is for us as grown people, but looking at it for kids, I mean, what do you say about that?
Well, you can see in a child's eyes when a child runs up to you and gets ready to grab you, and you've got to,
Yeah,
and you can almost see the rejection.
yeah,
That child says, wow, this was a person that used to pick me up. This is a person that used to hold me. This is a person that used to be very intimate with me. And yet this person now just, and I think that's disturbing to children and youth. It's very disturbing.
especially when they real young and can't really understand it. But Cal, you had made mention earlier about rugged individualism and things that are being debunked by COVID.
Yes, sir. From American style democracy on down, COVID-19 has revealed a number of flaws in our thinking, and the whole concept of rugged individualism is one of them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what we find out is we in all actuality, are social creatures,
Yes.
and we do need that social event for our lives on a consistent basis. And that can, that disturbs a lot. I mean, not only are you looking at physical, but you're looking at mental as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you
And
have.
spiritual. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Excuse me. My apologies. One of the things you're also seeing is an uptick in suicides. Also, people that are trying to get intervention for the mental health issues that they have. And you're seeing people also numerically around the nation for sure, and I'm sure it's reflected in many parts of the world. You're seeing the alcoholism and drug addiction and deaths because of drug addiction increase.
Okay.
Because people are by themselves. At least when they used to get high, they would have somebody around them.
Yeah.
But now they're by themselves, and so they have nobody to be there for them
Yeah.
when they overdose.
Right. Right. But let's look at it too. The added stressor of kids having to interact via Zoom for class, or via whatever other form of media for class, and not being in person, adding that confusion on, not just on the kids, but on the parents as well, and the stress in that home. Here's a question for you, and maybe you don't have the answer for this, but are you seeing any upticks in domestic violence?
Oh,
also?
definitely. Definitely. One of the things, even on my broadcast that I do every Saturday morning, I have on my page, pinned to it, domestic violence hotline, suicide prevention hotline. I have all those hotlines on there
Yeah.
because, yes, there's been an uptick. And again, in our community, there's a stigma attached to mental illness. You know, a lot of people don't want to admit they need counseling, they need medication, and sometimes our faith community can be indicted for just saying pray
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
for issues that need more than prayer.
We have a tendency to think that prayer is our end all be all. But Jesus said, watch as well as pray.
Yes. Yeah.
It's one thing for us to pray, and then our prayer turns into action.
Yes.
It's another thing for us just to pray.
Correct.
That's what superstition is.
Wishful thinking.
Right. That's what superstition is. You just wishing that it'll happen. But if you really, really have a prayer life, your prayer life leads you to act. God calls us to act, or Spirit calls us to act.
And in those actions, there's also the spirits leading to those individuals that are trained, those individuals that can actually help you to be able to deal with whatever issues that you're working through or walking through. But yeah, I think the other thing when you talked about it, just to kind of just go back for a moment as well, when you talk about pressure, you talked about being able to be on Zoom and being able to have school on. A lot of because of the digital divide, a lot of our children can't get on it.
Right.
And so imagine the stress of a parent that does not have access to.
Right.
Because you're talking about, we're in Alabama, and when you talk about the digital divide, that's real. And in most of these small communities, they do not have the infrastructure to be able to have the internet access.
That's exciting that you would actually lead into that, because that's where I was going next. Looking at the lack of moratoriums, looking at the disconnects from utility that's starting to take place now, the lack of broadband in certain communities and certain places, that level of stress, that with having that lack of access, in addition to a pandemic, in addition to the uprisings, in addition to the climate devastation and the hurricanes, fires, but I mean just in Alabama, having to deal with all this stuff that's happened in Alabama pretty much simultaneously. And then you look at it, for those who are in poverty, those are the ones who struggle the most, those are the ones who suffer the most, and those are the ones who are in imminent harm because they already don't have it. And now they're being required to come up with that as well, what they already don't have.
And the economic devastation has been mounting because food stamps have been cut, 60, 70,000 last year in the state.
Yeah, yeah.
We already have been protesting continually about for Medicaid expansion.
Yeah.
So that people would actually have access to help. But let me tell you how messed up this is. In the city of Montgomery, which is the capital of the state, which is the largest city in the Black Belt. In that city, many people that were dealing with COVID-19 were kind of diagnosed and sent home. Even though their condition probably merited them being in a hospital setting. So imagine the tension now. I'm sick, I'm poor, I'm not going to get the access that I need because a lot of it's not even there. On top of the fact that I still have children to take care of, family members that are relying on me. And this economic piece is one thing when you have a piece of bread. It's another thing when you have no piece of bread.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And in Alabama, many people now don't have a piece of bread.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I agree. I was having a conversation with Cara McClure. Same thing, conversations in the park, and she was telling me how when she used to drive to Montgomery to help elderly people, and how some would have to decide whether or not they would have do medicine that month or pay their utility bill.
Or eat.
Or eat.
I mean,
what kind of society do we live in when we don't take care of our elders? What kind of society do we live in when we don't take care of our orphans or our children? In other words, what kind of society do we live in when we don't take care of the most vulnerable amongst us?
I mean, when you think about, and I'm glad you brought that in, because you also know that I'm president of Youth Towers. And we deal with young adults, the ages of 19 to 26, bringing them from homelessness. We have over 398 young people in our continuum of care right now.
Wow.
Can you imagine what it's like? But the systemic thing you were talking about, that's why I'm bringing that in.
Yeah.
The systemic piece is that a good percentage of these young people were in foster care. Once they aged out, they were on their own. And were never taught to be self-sufficient. So now you've got somebody that's been in the system, bounced all over the place, and the same people that would die on somebody having an abortion could care less about how these children are being treated that are here.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's something that I ask, and even more, how can you be so concerned about a fetus, but you got real life babies, black and brown babies, in cages at the border? You as a chaplain, seeing the cases, knowing from a first-hand perspective what you see coming through hospitals, talking to now communities of faith leaders, forget me and Kylie here, what would you say to faith leaders and communities of faith about reopening and dealing with the grief of not being able to reopen?
I think you have to address, first of all, you have to address it. You can't not deal with the fact that people are grieving, people are broken, people are wounded, people are hurting. I mean, in this hour, first of all, I believe it's irresponsible to bring your people into the church right now, especially since the majority of our people in the church are elderly and children. I mean, that's most of your populations as it is. But secondarily, I believe that we need to be able to address, to the best of our training and ability, the grief of our people. One of the things I did, not to use myself as any guy's standard, but one of the things I did 2 weeks ago is I had a grief seminar that I did on the phone with several of my people that are going through. I had one of my church members has lost probably about 8 or 10 family members. And the church and that's grandmother and grandkids and all the rest of them, they've lost about 8 or 10 folk within the last 6 months.
Wow.
And some of them have lost others. So you've got to continue to recognize, and see, in the black community, what you said is hard.
Yeah.
And it's hard because grief is something that becomes layered in our community on a regular basis.
Yep. Constantly.
It's constantly a shooting, leukemia, dead asthma died. There's always something in our community, in our communions, that takes us to that point of grief and lament. Yeah. And so you have to, as a part of your ministry, period, you've got to recognize with your sermons. Every sermon can't leave you shouting.
Right.
Some sermons you have to leave there feeling the grief, the lament. That's why lamentation is so serious with me, is you've got to be able to walk through that and walk through what that loss feels like and what that sense of personhood is when you no longer have that individual to be able to reflect off of. Yeah. And I think that's part of really recognizing that ministry is more than making folks shout. It's more than getting paid. It's a genuine commitment to your people that says that I'm willing to empathize with you. I'm willing to walk with you, cry with you, and I'll do what I can.
Yeah, you said something in that. You said not having that other person there to reflect off of. But when we look at it from a broader perspective, a more micro perspective, you look at um, the church not opening, and those who identify with the church, and you know, not necessarily a person, but this whole tradition of and this whole model of church. And I think that's where a lot of pastors find themselves in. And I used to be like, no, you need to,
No.
you don't need to go back in your church and this, that, and the other, and feeling hard on them about it until I realized I had to step back for a second and understand that they're grieving loss.
Oh yeah,
And they don't want to let this model go.
Right.
Even though this model is cancerous, and and if you touch this model, it's a possibility that you get sick too. You know, or contagious rather, not cancerous, but contagious. And if you touch it, you get sick too. It's but because of this, um, I don't want to call it addiction. I think that's a little too strong. But I don't know what less to call it, of this model of ministry. It's hard for them to get out of that. And how do we deal with that piece?
And that's a challenge because you've jumped off into theology.
Right.
And unfortunately, I think we're dealing with several things. One, many people's relationship is not necessarily with God, it's with the building.
Say that.
So theologically, if I can't go to the building, I can't meet God.
Say that.
And that's real problematic all by itself.
Yeah.
I think then the secondary piece of that is that we don't understand what it means for us to be church, be the body of Christ.
Okay.
Because it's not about a place, it's about a person, a being. And that's relational, as well as the relationships we have. And I think that that's really going to be one of the difficulties we have, is reframing our encounters with God outside of a building.
Yeah. So, Cal, when I'm teaching and I'm talking and being a part of all these million Zoom meetings, these million, trillion Zoom meetings we doing these days, it's always interesting to me, in particular when I'm with communities of faith, it's always interesting to me the emphasis that people put on, or the energy people put behind trying to get back to that old model, instead of seeing the opportunity to design something new. And a part of our issue is, and this is for interfaith community that is trying to rush back into a building without it being for the purpose of serving. The problem with our worship today is that we do good with looking up. We put on a good show of worship. But I tell them, you know, we don't bother to look around us when we're going from that building to the car. So you don't know what's happening in the community that is surrounding that worship facility. And I don't care what religious background you have, there's no religious background, even if it's Satanism, that doesn't tell you to serve.
Have mercy.
That doesn't tell you to not to live
Have mercy.
as individuals and not live as community. None.
But again, it depends on your perspective of church. It's not how many folk are in the seat, it's how many is in the street. How many do you send? You know, and that's been one of the things that I'm grateful for, is I've been able to see a microcosm. And again, I'm not trying to make my church all, because it's not, we got our issues too. But I'm just saying that they had been feeding people weekly for months while this was going on. Because they recognized the fact that the human need continues, the struggle continues, and people still have needs. But you're right, though. I mean, that's catastrophic in that mindset.
So one of the things that we did, and Cal knows about this as well and can speak on it. But one of the things we did was start at Energize Alabama, and it's a part of our larger program, a larger campaign, which is Energize the South for Energy Justice. But Energize Alabama for Energy Justice, we wanted to tackle both the practical as well as the political or the policy issue. And so tackling the practical is helping our most vulnerable. We partnered with 4 churches as well as one of our community partners who does collective action. But we partnered with them to serve the community. We had some money that was given for COVID relief. We then said, hey, let's build out this model where we empower or equip rather communities of faith so that they can serve their community. And at the same time, we want to advocate for policies that cause our Public Service Commission to put the public back in the service, that cause them to be more transparent, cause them to be more accountable, cause them to be more equitable, and cause them to be more creative. We lack creation. Just as we have these old models of ministry that we are addicted to as communities of faith and as faith leaders, our government system has old models of moving our society. And unfortunately, these old models are what's destroying our planet and our society. And we too stuck to even think creatively on what that can look like when all of it's falling down at our feet. We're steady trying to prop it back up. Kyle, I'll let you get on that because I'll jump on that and keep going and keep going and keep going.
All right. Well, I'll be happy to throw out something controversial. Sure. So we all come from a Judeo-Christian background. We're an interfaith organization, and we draw from all faiths. But just talking about our Judeo-Christian background, what did the early church look like? You're talking about going back to an earlier model. Let's go way back. Let's go back to what the first church looked like. Read your book of Acts in the Bible. These people sold everything they had and lived in common, helping one another out. It wasn't about, and in the book of James it says, if you tell your brother, hey, essentially good luck, but stay warm, be well, but you don't do anything to help them. If you see a brother in need and you don't, or sister or anyone in need and you don't do anything to help them, can that faith save you? My church is St. Junia. Before COVID-19, we made a conscious decision to step away from the building, which becomes an icon in and of itself. And we became a series of house churches like the early church. And so COVID-19 is an opportunity for a number of faiths to take a hard look at what their house of faith looks like. Maybe it ain't a building.
Yeah, our previous episode, we actually had Dr. Dave Barnhart, Reverend Dr. Dave Barnhart, who's the pastor of St. Junia, and we talked about, his model of ministry and the church being courageous enough to create new models of ministry. Again, it's about serving the people. It was always intended to be about serving the people. Somehow we got caught up into it being about serving the building and serving the leader.
If the church ain't a safety net, it ain't the church.
Definitely. I mean, when you definitely look at church history, and you don't have to go that far back. You look at least in the black church tradition, you look at what happened after the Great Migration.
Well, I'm saying the church grew under the social gospel.
Yeah. But that's a
under
part
the
of
social gospel. It grew under this new gospel, this evangelicalism type of craziness that we got, and
they solved that whole "you cannot serve God and mammon" problem. It's all a matter of rebranding,
right?
What about look at Jesus?
the church is shrinking and shrinking and dividing and dividing.
No
off and
power.
Shrinking even more.
No power.
And nothing's moving.
No power.
The people aren't protected and nothing's moving.
What did Jesus say in Luke 4, his first inaugural sermon? The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me,
For it has
because he
anointed
anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek, to bind up the brokenhearted, to set at liberty the captives, the open of the prison and them that are bound, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. But he also, in Matthew 25, he also talks about the least of these, those that were hungry, those that are sick, those that are suffering. If your character, see, that's the issue. If your character is not a character where you care about broken people and wounded people and suffering people, then you can make it all about the money or this perceived political power.
You saying some Christians are going to be surprised at the separating of the sheep and the goats?
Oh, I think they're going to be blown away, literally.
And
But you're right.
Our
I agree.
ancestors used to say it like this: I got shoes, you got shoes.
Oh,
Oh
God.
God, people got shoes. everybody trying to go to heaven, but everybody ain't gonna get there.
My Lord, my Lord. But that's so true, though, and I appreciate you just bringing that out. You all bringing that out, because the reality is that because the church has lost its soul to a certain degree in America, because much of what we see as church now is nothing but nationalism.
Yeah.
And this nationalistic perspective is all about being faithful to a government, and Christ has been commodified.
Yeah, what happened to our citizenships in heaven? That all went out the window.
Yeah, no.
Ralph Reed, wasn't it? But yeah.
And the sad part, I've been reading, and Cal know about it. I read rather. It's a book called One Nation Under God. When corporate stole Christianity or something like that. And it really goes back into the history of the evangelical movement. And you realize that the way that we have our theology now was purposeful to push capitalism.
Of course.
And it's like
Yeah.
this theology, the whole name it and claim it, prosperity gospel, is birthed out of capitalism. It's not birthed out of the church. It's not birthed out of the scriptures. It's not birthed out of the revelation or out of special revelation. It was made by the hands of corporate interests getting with evangelicalism and designing a theology that pushes production and consumerism. And now our whole society sees things as consumers.
But again, that still came out of the fact that this nation was birthed with a hunger for free labor. And so
Not
they
a
had
hunger. Don't say a hunger. A
Addicted.
need.
Okay.
No, a need.
Yeah.
Capitalism has to have free and cheap labor
Period.
in order to thrive.
Period.
It cannot thrive without it.
Period. And so when you talk about that corporate piece, there had to be a biblical, philosophical justification for somebody being on the bottom and somebody being on the top,
Right.
so I can get paid.
Right.
And so when you look at evangelicalism in its rugged form, you realize the toxicity of this system.
Yeah.
And now we're at a point where it's like, we know it doesn't work. But the question becomes,
Are we creative enough?
bold enough,
Are we courageous enough
audacious enough
to design a future that's more equitable and more just? Are we humble enough to listen to those who are most affected by the decisions that we make?
Yes, sir.
And the reality is our system was set up with the elite in mind, and it was the elite who was voting for the masses. Period, point blank. If you look at the political structure, unless you have so many dollars in the bank, you can't even get in the race.
It was never. Let's go back to the Constitution, because it's still a piece of that.
Not a piece of
It was
it.
never.
That's what they leaned on. This
It
that
was-
go with the Constitution. Yeah, the Constitution wasn't never
It wasn't-
set up for me.
It was never. It wasn't set up for anybody that was poor,
If
other than
you
white
didn't-
males.
If you wasn't a white male who owned property, it does
Not-
not speak for you.
That's it. Period.
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 And it doesn't speak for you as a person. It speaks for your property.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
That's
you.
what the police job is to do.
Which is exactly why now corporations are regarded as people under the law, but
Correct.
trees, rivers, and other people aren't.
Isn't that something?
Absolutely.
So as we
Absolutely.
and so when you look at the heart of this, that piece of really being willing to see things differently means that if we don't, what happens if we don't?
What happens if we don't?
We don't see things differently. We don't move toward, and it looks like it's going to be pretty hard right now with what we're dealing with, to a more just society.
Scientists have said that there's no telling what it's going to look like. We're starting to get into unpredicted waters. Period.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the planet is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the society is concerned, you already see it. You don't have to say what is it going to look like. You see what it's going to look like. Just imagine that on steroids.
Yeah.
And that's the part that's really disheartening, because we're seeing the amplification of sickness and disease. We're seeing the amplification of homelessness. We're seeing the amplification of hopelessness. We're seeing the amplification of these things that are germane to life
Yeah.
being stripped away.
Yeah. I mean, it's when George Floyd said he couldn't breathe,
My Lord.
the world took a gasp. Black folks said, we've been trying to tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
But what has changed? What has changed? Nothing. You saw it. They saw it for themselves. It took everybody back. Everybody was in the street. What changed? What policies
Have
changed?
mercy, have mercy, have mercy.
What changed? Nothing. Nothing. And now white folk tired, and they in their house again. Black folk tired, and they in their house again.
You know, it's frightening.
And we'll wait on the next shooting to come around for
But-
bring
but
us
it's been-
back
but it's been
out so we
happening
can have this
nonstop.
outrage again.
Over several weeks ago, over 163 black people have been killed by the police. And that has been, there's been more since then.
What I was getting ready to say, but the reality is it hadn't stopped.
Correct.
And at this point, we're starting to get into the dangerous territory of normalizing this. That's also what we've done with climate. That's also what we've done with pollution. We've normalized it. And so now we live with instead of being against. We have the power to stop it. I said it. They got political power. They even got economical power. But we got people power. If we could just get together and serve one another and not our own interests. Listen, we thank you for being with us today. We thank you for sharing with us, Rev. We thank you all for listening to us. We hope that something has been said that has both been entertaining and educational, that it has been both enlightening and challenging, and that you'll go out and you'll do something with the things that we talked about. Today, as always, my brothers and sisters, we offer to you love, peace, and light.